Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we commence a 5-week series on the topic Nuclear War, the Dangers and Realities. This 5-week series is in conjunction with a symposium that has been held at North Idaho College. And on our first program, I'm very happy to welcome to the TV program and to our campus Rear Admiral Eugene J. Carroll. Admiral Carroll joined the service in April 1945 and was in the service for 37 years. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1972. Admiral Carroll served in several positions, including General Alexander Haig's staff in Europe from 1977 to 1979. His last assignment on active duty before his retirement was in the Pentagon as Assistant Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Plans, Policy, and Operations. In this capacity, he was engaged in U.S. naval planning for conventional and nuclear war. Admiral Carroll is going to be with us today to talk or discuss the overview of the nuclear arms race in relation to how it fits this 5-week series. Admiral Carroll, welcome to the program.
Nice to be aboard.
I'm happy to welcome to the panel to question our guest today. First of all, regular panelist Mary Lou Reed, and as always, we're very happy to have her with us.
Thank you, Tony.
And our second panelist, who's been with us before, is Mr. Bob Kabler, Chairman of the Physical Sciences and Mathematics Division at North Idaho College. Welcome,
Good to be
Bob.
here, Tony.
We'll commence the question with Lou Reed.
Admiral Carroll, would you please bring some clarity to the question of who's ahead in this so-called nuclear arms race, the United States or Russia? Do you think it's possible to make these comparisons, and are they meaningful?
Comparisons can be made. They're meaningful if you don't try to go too far with them. For example, the United States has more weapons than the Soviet Union, 30,000 to 20,000, and we can deliver more weapons on the Soviet Union, 12,000 to, say, 7,500 Soviet weapons back on us. Theirs are bigger, ours are more reliable, more accurate. But if you try to get down to who's ahead on the basis of those figures, you don't come up with the right answer because nobody's ahead. We can destroy the Soviets can destroy us. It doesn't make any difference who attacks first and who retaliates. Both sides are destroyed, and there's no way to be superior when you're dead.
In other words, you don't believe that there is any way to win a nuclear war?
Absolutely. There will be no winners in a nuclear war, only losers.
And so what is the next step from there?
In my estimation, we have to give up this idea that we're following in the United States today, that somehow or other we can build up enough additional nuclear strength, more than 17,000 new nuclear weapons in our present program, and gain a measure of superiority over the Soviet Union. That isn't going to happen. The Soviets have said that they will keep up with this. They have the capability, and all we're going to be doing is driving the nuclear arms race up the ladder, out of sight. What we need to do as an alternative is come together and negotiate mutual and verifiable agreements to control, limit, and reduce these nuclear weapons to the mutual benefit of both sides.
Mr. Kabler.
Admiral, how do you propose to have the United States and the Soviet Union get together to initiate some of this reduction?
Well, we're talking in Geneva now, but we're talking on the basis of certain proposals which are really non-negotiable. The United States has presented a 0-0 option at Geneva and then modified it slightly. That cannot be negotiated. We have presented a proposal to reduce strategic arms, but it would be such a drastic reduction for the Soviet Union, while the United States went right on building new weapons such as the MX and the Trident II, that's not negotiable either. What we need to do is to give up the idea that we're going to win a negotiation. We're going to have to go in there with the idea we're going to find mutual benefits for both sides so that each of us comes out of the negotiation safer and furthermore confident that they can verify that each party is complying with the agreement. When we can do that, a mutual benefit that's verifiable, then we'll have good arms control treaties.
Pursuing the verification part, we keep hearing that the Soviet Union is unwilling to allow any on-site inspection of nuclear facilities. Is that not a problem with ever achieving any any arms control?
Yes and no. In the first place, on-site inspection is useful for verifying certain specific arrangements, but in most cases, the verification requirements do not force either side to have on-site inspection. Our satellites, our listening systems, our commercial and industrial espionage let us know very well what's going on in the Soviet Union, and we can verify almost all important elements of nuclear arms agreements with our national technical means and other systems that do not need to be in Russia. On the other hand, the Russians have agreed in writing formally in a report to the United Nations to certain conditions under which on-site inspections would be permitted. And in fact, recently they invited the United Nations to send observers to their nuclear facilities, power facilities, to conduct safeguards inspections. So they are showing an increasing willingness in formal discussions to accept this sort of inspection.
Admiral Carroll, I think there's one area that's certainly confusing to many of our viewers. It certainly is to me when I hear the discussions about the arms talks that are going on. And you are certainly in a position to share with us expert knowledge. What exactly is in the American proposal and what is in the counter Soviet proposal? Has either side given any ground? Or if we signed either proposal now, what would it mean for the other side?
Well, of course, we have two proposals there, and the one that is most in the news today is the so-called 0-0 option for intermediate range missiles. And in this agreement, the United States has proposed that the Soviet Union withdraw and dismantle about 580 existing missiles. Some of them are SS-4s and 5s, old weapons, and some of them are SS-20s, rather new ones. In exchange for that, the United States says that we will build, but not deploy to Europe, 572 new cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles. Well, this turns out to be not a very attractive proposal to the Soviet Union for two reasons. One, they've had these weapons in one form or another for more than 18 years. And we're suddenly saying, oh, well, times have changed, you must get rid of all of yours, and not only that, you must dismantle them, do away with them physically. Whereas we will go ahead and build 572 new, very potent weapons. We just won't deploy them to Europe. And in the Russian mind, that says, not now you won't deploy them, but what happens in time of crisis? So that they're very much concerned about that. The other concern, of course, is that the Soviets know that pointing at them are more than 100 Chinese missiles, about 98 French missiles, and 64 British missiles. And they say, those have to count. Those threaten us. We have to have missiles to respond to those. And the United States is saying, no other weapons count except ours. So the proposal is simply non-negotiable. The small modification that President Reagan offered about 2 weeks ago is really just a version of the 0-0 option. It's no different in spirit or substance. It just says, oh, well, you can keep 300 weapons, and we'll put in 300 new weapons. It still leaves all of the imbalance due to the Chinese, the French, and the British in place, and once again is not negotiable on the part of the Soviets.
Then the Soviet proposal also, if adopted in its present form, would give the Soviets an advantage too.
Yes, the Soviets have not been well documented. Our government hasn't explained in much detail what the Soviets have offered, but it appears they've offered some sort of a proportional arrangement in which they would keep 162 of their missiles to counter the British and French, and we would not deploy any to Europe. But what that ignores is that each one of those missiles the Soviets would keep would have 3 warheads on it. So they'd really be keeping around 500 weapons, and that would give them a fairly substantial capability.
Lou Reed.
Is it true that we do not have a no first strike policy? Is that correct? Or what is the U.S. position on first strike?
Yep. We have to distinguish here between first strike, which is by nuclear metaphysics, is the devastating attack on the central strategic forces of the other side by your long-range systems. Very short notice, 30 minutes, and you are trying to destroy their major forces. Now, there we not only have no plans to do that, but we have no weapons really capable of doing it, nor do the Soviets. It's alleged they have a first strike capability, but it's not demonstrated. And certainly if the president's proposing to put our new MX missiles in fixed silos, he doesn't think they have a first strike capability either, because it wouldn't make any sense to do it if they haven't. That's first strike. First use is different. First use is in some sort of a conflict where hostilities are going forward, but with conventional weapons, one side or the other might then elect to introduce nuclear weapons on the battlefield, let's say. That's first use. The Russians, for political reasons, have said, oh, we would never make first use of the weapons. Never. We're honest, peace-loving people. But all that is political rhetoric. You don't know whether they would or wouldn't in time of crisis. The United States is probably more honest, but in a way politically at a disadvantage by saying, oh no, we reserve the right to make first use of nuclear weapons to use against an attacking enemy. So we're in an unpopular position in the world's eyes by being this candid about our plans.
So you think basically on this issue we are using bad political rhetoric?
Bad political rhetoric, and we're not doing what we should do, which is go to the Soviet Union and say, hey, look, you say no first use. We're willing to say no first use, provided it is accompanied by agreements on arms control that are consistent with that declaration. For example, it's totally illogical to say no first use and at the same time both sides are building first use weapons, and they are.
Are there other means that you'd suggest where we should prove that we are trustworthy in addition to improving our rhetoric and our methods? Do you feel that there are things that we could be doing at home in terms of the defense budget, et cetera, that would show better faith?
At the present time, neither side is going to trust the other. The agreements are going to have to come on the basis of mutual interest and verifiability. I'll trust you when I can tell what you're doing. With respect to our budget, it has the stated purpose of enabling the United States to fight successfully and prevail in a protracted nuclear war. Now that's a pretty scary doctrine. I think we ought to be examining our military strategy and doctrine and examining very carefully to see whether planning to win a protracted nuclear war is a sensible doctrine. How much money are we going to waste in pursuing it if we find that there isn't any way to prevail? And in my opinion, there is none.
Bob Kabler.
Okay, I'd like to pursue one of the questions Mary Lou began. We so often hear this window of vulnerability mentioned in Ronald Reagan's reason for deploying the MX missile and for pursuing the cruise missile and the Trident submarines, etc. Would you define what's meant by window of vulnerability and whether there in fact is one?
Window of vulnerability is a political slogan which is probably the son of the missile gap. It somehow or other suggests that we are inferior to the Soviet Union, that they can inflict certain damage on us by a sudden strike which would prevent us from retaliating, and that simply is not true. There is no way the Soviets could possibly believe that we would not maintain the capability to return something like 5,000 to 7,000 nuclear weapons against their territory. And no one can tell me that a prudent Soviet planner is going to attack knowing that he must face that many nuclear weapons in return.
Admiral Carroll, in your speech to the campus, you indicated that there were 50,000 nuclear weapons combined from both sides. I would like you to do two things for our audience. First of all, indicate of those weapons how many the United States has that from where they're at now they could reach the Soviet Union, how many the Soviet Union could reach the United States. And then secondly, give us an example how destructive that number is by, I believe you use the statistic 400 nuclear weapons on each side, what it would do.
Yes. The Soviet Union has no tactical systems, that is short-range systems that can reach from their forces to our territory. So they can only strike the United States with about 7,500 to 7,800 nuclear weapons on their long-range systems, strategic systems. The United States has over 9,500 weapons in strategic systems which can reach the Soviet Union, and then they have another 2,500 or so in tactical systems. These are aircraft and short-range missiles that can reach the Soviet Union, and as a result, you can say in round terms, we can hit the Soviet Union with 12,000 weapons, they can hit us with something approaching 8,000. How many do we need? I mean, is that enough? Does that give us an advantage or a disadvantage? Calculations show that if we destroyed 400 selected targets in the Soviet Union, just 400, we would destroy 75% of their industrial capacity and kill 1/3 of their population promptly, and that's 50 to 75 million people. Now that ought to be enough to deter any rational party. And of course the Soviets can do the same thing to us. They can return their thousands of weapons on us, and the first 400 are going to kill tens and maybe even 100 million American citizens, depending on where they aim them. There's simply no way that either side can survive a strategic nuclear attack on their soil by the other side. And as I say, it doesn't make any difference who goes first and who retaliates. Both sides are destroyed.
Lou Reed.
Well, what direction would you like the defense budget to go then? I'm assuming that you are not for no defense at all, but you as a retired admiral, admirable admiral.
Thank you.
What would you like to see us spending our money on?
That has a lot of answers to it. The first thing is you're correct. I do believe in a sound national defense. The Soviets, particularly their leaders, are tough people. They're aggressive. They will take advantage of anything that's left around for them to exploit, and we're going to have to maintain a sensible defense capability for the foreseeable future. We're going to be competing with the Russians for the foreseeable future. My point is, we're strong enough to compete. We're the most powerful military nation in the world, and we certainly have the best political system, the best social structure. We respect our citizens and accord them their rights and their dignity. Our system is going to prevail in competition with the Soviet system, so why don't we get on with competing in better ways than simply more weapons? Specifically, I think our defense spending can come down safely. We can quit buying so many useless and wasteful weapons. We're buying very, very expensive weapons like nuclear carriers and M1 tanks and F-18 fighters and B-1B bombers. For heaven's sakes, there's no justification for spending $40 billion on 100 B-1B bombers, but that's the program we're aiming at. So I'd like to see the money coming out carefully where it does not add to our safety, it's just wasteful, and then we can take a look at what to do with that money in other ways in our economy. Should we reinvest it in production? Is it needed for programs to benefit some of our underprivileged citizens? That's a separate subject. How do we spend the money we don't waste on defense? I'll leave to you.
Well, what about the other countries other than Russia and our policies toward them in terms of the military? Do you feel that we have, as a country, a responsible position in selling arms to third world countries? And this isn't just really a war between the U.S. and the USSR.
The U.S. emphasizes military confrontation and challenge to the Soviet Union in every possible situation, and that includes the third world. The Center for Defense Information, which I represent, has found that there are 40 conflicts going on in the world today involving 45 nations, and of those nations, the United States is the principal supplier of arms to 20 of them, the Soviet Union to 13. So we are the leading party pushing military actions in the third world. Their problems are political, they're economic, they're certainly social, and you aren't going to solve any of these with guns. You just aren't going to do it. You can't stop an idea with a bullet.
These conflicts are increasing, as I understand it, from your magazine. And do you feel that this is, to some degree, the fault of the United States for encouraging military answers, or do you think the conflicts would be increasing anyway, and so it makes it even more impingent on us to change our policies?
I don't think the United States is generating these things, but I think once they start and we see a requirement to get in with our weapons, send military assistants and advisors and arms, that we radicalize them more than they would have to be, and that we think we're hurting the Soviet Union in the process. That's the real rationale for doing it. We're thwarting the Soviet Union. George Kennan, our former ambassador to the Soviet Union, has said the U.S. foreign policy today is basically whatever's bad for the Soviet Union is good for the United States. Well, that's obviously a very simplistic idea of how to work in a very difficult world order, and we should stop radicalizing these situations and look for solutions which use our strengths. economically, we're way ahead of the Soviet Union. We can produce food that those people need. We can produce pure water and medical care, and there are lots of ways for us to influence the outcome of events in the third world other than trying to shoot people to make them behave.
That's a very positive answer.
Bob Kaler.
Okay, I guess I have a multi-part question. Let me ask the first part now. We so often hear the argument made by those who support increased defense spending that this is important in a time of a downturn in our economy to put these federal dollars into defense spending so that we can increase the number of jobs in our country. But yet they seem to oppose spending by the federal government in other areas, such as federal highway projects or something like that. So would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a really big question. The first part of the answer is many studies have shown that the least efficient way to create jobs is to spend money on weapons. There are a lot of reasons for this, but I won't list them. The studies show that on the average, military expenditures of $1 billion produce about 16,000 to 18,000 jobs. Expenditures in the civilian sector for typical industrial production, automobiles and refrigerators and TV sets and so on, will produce twice as many jobs. And highway construction and building educational institutions and certain service industries may produce as many as 70,000 jobs per $1 billion investment. So you can see that when we're using a military budget of $280 billion, which is what President Reagan has asked for in the 1984 budget, that isn't going to produce nearly as many jobs as some part of that money put into other forms of enterprise in the United States. Military production is a poor way to create jobs and help the economy.
Okay. And my second part doesn't quite relate to that, but we have not mentioned at all here the cruise missile. I know you have very strong feelings about the cruise missile. Would you care to?
Well, the cruise missile, for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with it, is a little pilotless airplane. It's about 21 feet long, has very small wings on it, can be easily concealed. We're going to make more than 5,000 of them for our new cruise missile force. We're going to put a bomb in the nose of each one, which is about 15 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. And then we're going to deploy them so that they just completely envelop the Soviet Union. We're going to put them on mobile ground launchers on land. We're going to put them on airplanes, the B-52s. We're going to put them on ships, and we're going to put them in submarines. And just surround the Russians with a completely new dimension to the nuclear threat. Now, if that would put us ahead and make them behave themselves, maybe that would be a pretty good strategy. But practically speaking, we know the Russians are already looking at developing their own cruise missile concept. So we're going to end up each threatening the other with these massive numbers of new weapons. Most importantly, once they're deployed and out of sight, it's going to be very hard to find out where they are, how many of them have been built and deployed, and get arms control agreements to reduce the threat. That will be the hardest thing for arms control in the future that I can foresee is pulling the cruise missiles back once they're out. It's one of the reasons it's very important we get on with these arms control agreements now before each side has built these systems, when it's still possible to control them.
Admiral Kell, you also addressed today the question of security of the country from an economic viewpoint, and you gave some rather interesting statistics about over the next 5 years or so, the defense spending and how that compares to the national debt and the deficit. Would you elaborate upon that with our viewers, please?
Well, the figures I quoted, of course, were the President's plans for the present budget, 1983 budget, which is, these numbers are staggering, $245.5 billion obligated for military programs. And then in the 84, it goes $280.5 billion. The next year, $330 billion. The next year, $365 billion, which happens to be $1 billion a day. It goes up to $397 billion, and then in 1988, the last year of the 5-year plan, it is $433 billion for the year. That's over this year, the 1983 budget, and the 5-year plan. That's over $2 trillion, or $1 billion a day, for military programs. I don't know what that's going to do to the deficits. There's no way, really, that the deficits can be brought under control with that level of spending. What's it going to do to our economy? What's it going to do to inflation and interest rates? What's it going to do to our world trade? I was asked a very good question today. Somebody wanted to know about, are all of our good scientists and technicians going into military programs? And the answer is yes. The United States puts more money into research and development and engineering of new military systems than any other nation in the world. And as a result, we cut short what we're putting into the civilian side, and as a result, our economic position is weakening. We're losing out in competition to many nations which don't have this military investment.
Lou Reed.
A questionnaire, Admiral, that was put out by your organization, the Center for Defense Information, asks, among other things, do you think the American people are adequately informed on military issues? And one, what is your personal answer to that? And two, how do people answer? Do you feel that this is an area that...
They get a lot of information, but some of it is not factual. I would say that's the thing that is lacking, is factual content instead of political rhetoric.
And whom can they trust?
Well, we certainly think you can trust the Center for Defense Information because we've been publishing these reports for 11 years and they've never been challenged for their factual content. Somebody may argue with our conclusions and recommendations, but the facts on which we've reached those findings have not been challenged. As a matter of fact, our most recent complete review of the American nuclear stockpile, how many weapons we have of what kind, was commented on in the Pentagon as being one of the most comprehensive statements based on careful research they'd ever seen. The Congress doesn't get that kind of information. The administration doesn't even go to the Congress and say, this is how many weapons we want to build. They just go up with one little piece of the puzzle at a time and sell it one piece at a time. So there's another place that more information is needed, is at Congress. I would urge people also to look at many organizations such as SANE, Common Cause, Physicians for Social Responsibility. Ground Zero is doing excellent work in putting out information about the military systems in the world. There's lots of sources to look for factual information, and I think the citizens should be making an effort to get it and then compare the rhetoric with the facts.
And the media perhaps should be making more of an effort to get this across also.
We provide all our material to the media, and we're very happy when they use it.
Fine.
With that, I have to bring our program to a conclusion. I'm sorry we're out of time. Rear Admiral Carroll, I want to thank you very much for being with us. You've been most informative.
Thank you.
I express my appreciation of the panel also. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today has been Rear Admiral Eugene J. Carroll, and this is the first in a 5-week series dealing with this whole question of the possibility of nuclear war and the arms race in that field. I hope you're going to be with us for the next 4 programs when, again, we'll be bringing you experts in the field that will discuss this very important subject. If you have learned as much as we have today, then I think it certainly made this program worthwhile. I hope you have a good week and that you'll be with us again next week. This is Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we bring you program number 2 in a 5-week series on the topic nuclear war, the dangers and realities. Our guest today is going to discuss the subtopic, an assessment of the National Administration's nuclear arms control efforts, particularly the issue of defense buildup and the START talks. Our guest has a very distinguished background. He holds a B.A. cum laude from Harvard University and an M.I.A. from Columbia. Under the Reagan administration, during the transition period from the Carter administration, he served as the Deputy Transition Team Chief at the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. As acting counsel of ACDA, he had top secret clearance concerning analysis and classification of Soviet compliance with the arms control treaties. He has also served a 7-year period with the Central Intelligence Agency of the U.S. government. At the present time, our guest serves in Senator Steve Sims' office as a legislative assistant for budget, defense, and foreign affairs. He also takes on another duty to Senator James McClure from Idaho in the area of Defense Appropriations Subcommittee work. Mr. Sullivan, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
And as always, I'm very happy to have the regular panel member of this program to join me in questioning our guest today, Mary Lou Reed, and we will ask her to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Mr. Sullivan, let me begin by asking you if you sincerely believe that Russia does not want to have a nuclear war.
Absolutely. I don't think Soviet leaders or American leaders, Soviet people, Russian people, or American people desire nuclear war. I think there is a large agreement in the two nations toward the prevention of nuclear war. If nuclear war was to happen, it would be by accident or by third nations perhaps precipitating a nuclear war. But I don't think either leaders of either country desire nuclear war.
Well, if you believe this, what do you feel the Reagan administration can accomplish that is constructive by stressing the Soviet superior military position and accusing them of not being in compliance with the SALT agreements? Is this not perhaps a slightly belligerent stance?
I don't think so. I think that the United States would serve the cause of world peace and stability toward achieving parity in forces again. When forces are equal and survivable, there is no incentive or no possibility, little possibility of nuclear war. In regard to the accusations of Soviet non-compliance with existing arms control treaties, it's the hope that the President and others will preserve the integrity of the existing arms control process by enforcing Soviet compliance. So again, I think it's a positive effort on the part of the administration.
Could you explain just a little bit more about what you mean by parity? When we talk about parity, frequently we use that in relationship to agricultural products. What do you mean parity of nuclear weapons?
Parity is difficult to define. You can define it in numerical terms, quantitative terms. You can define it in terms of a static exchange or a dynamic exchange of forces. But what I would define as parity is a situation where neither side has any incentive to strike first. That is, both sides have roughly the same number of weapons, and both sides have invulnerable weapons, so that neither side can strike first at the other. And when you have such a situation, you not only have parity, but you have stability. And that's what we are striving for.
Do you think parity is actually something that can ever be achieved?
Yes, we've had parity before. In the period of the late 60s, we had parity. It was a safer posture for both sides in the view of some experts. Some people would say we should have superiority, and that we were extremely safe when we were way ahead of the Soviets. But I don't subscribe to that. I think that then we cause the Soviets to be nervous, and that's not healthy for the world either, for the Soviets to be worried about us. So I think in a situation where both sides have relatively invulnerable forces and relatively comparable numbers of forces, then there is no incentive to do anything at all with those forces, and then we would have a stable and peaceful structure.
Okay.
Mr. Sullivan, on last week's program, Rear Admiral Carroll was here, and he took the position or had a thesis that we had parity now, and he wasn't concerned about the comparison between two countries from that viewpoint, but rather working towards very serious arms reduction on both sides. In your presentation to our community and to our college today, you indicated a disagreement with this particular thesis, and you came forth with one indicating that you believe that over the past 20 years there's been a very rapid buildup in the Soviet Union, and I believe I'm quoting correctly when you indicated for the last 10 years you thought they had superiority over the Soviet Union in the nuclear arms race. Would you put forth your thesis with your documentation that you have? He did the same last week, indicating in areas in which you think the Soviet Union is superior and why.
Well, this chart here, which I would refer to, was used by President Reagan last November
to answer the same kind of question. And this shows that in 1962, the United States was far superior to the Soviets in missiles and bombers. In 1972, at the time of SALT I, there was what can be described as rough equality, but that now, in 1982, the Soviets have a substantial margin of superiority. Now, I don't think that's disputable. President Reagan has said this 3 times. The experts on both sides of the question of nuclear freeze agree about the numbers. The numbers are indisputable. Soviet military leaders have said that they have superiority. American political leaders and military leaders have said that they have superiority. So I don't really think there's much dispute about this situation. Now, what is in dispute is the meaning of it. Does it endanger us or not to be inferior this way to the Soviets? And I suggest, and others do too, that it does. It is not a stable situation. Not only do we have fewer numbers than the Soviets, but the Soviets have a capability to wipe us out down to a very low level with only a small portion of their forces. And that's very dangerous and very destabilizing.
In relation to your chart, now you're speaking of strategic missiles and bombers
strategic
combined.
missiles and bombers combined. Now, for Admiral Carroll to say that we have parity today, he's ignoring the fact that in 1969, President Nixon rejected the fact that we had superiority, in fact that we had parity. He asserted we had parity then. He called it sufficiency. And we've had varying degrees of reduced sufficiency since 1969. The debate over whether or not we had parity has been going on for over 10 years, while our posture has gotten worse and worse and the Soviets have gotten more and more. We can continue to debate whether we have parity for the next 10 years if we wish, but this kind of disparity actually exists, and we can call it parity if we like.
In relation to this, apparently it's one of the vital questions for the American people to try to decide if we, as we move toward looking at the arms negotiations. Admiral Carroll also indicated to our audience that as far as delivery systems and potential of the 50,000 nuclear weapons that exist, that in his research and experts that join him, that the United States has approximately 12,000 such weapons that could be delivered onto the Soviet Union, whereas the Soviet Union had about 8,000, although their weapons were larger, but ours was more accurate, and our technology seemed to be better. Would you agree with this particular conclusion, or do you think the Soviet Union has a superiority in delivery systems and number of bombs that they could deliver on the United States?
When I said there's substantial agreement about the numbers, there is substantial agreement between Admiral Carroll and myself and others that these disparities exist. When you look at the Center for Defense Information's numbers, 50,000 warheads on both sides, 12,000 for us and 8,000 for them in the intercontinental area, there is not agreement. They count things differently than the government counts them, and differently than congressional experts count them. And I think would be a very useful thing for the Center for Defense Information and the American Security Council to get together and have a order of battle debate or conference in which the two contending outside government organizations who are most expert in this area actually compared what they count and why they're slightly different. I mean, there is not a whole lot of difference, but there are some significant differences.
Would the other organization that you mentioned, in addition to the Center for Defense Information, would they agree that we have a larger potential of delivery than the Soviet Union?
No, the government now says that the Soviets have more warheads than we do. My numbers show that they have 1,000 more than we do. Just the reverse of the Center for Defense Information's tally of 12,000 versus 8,000. I've told members of the Center for Defense Information that such an order of battle conference would be useful, and that we would participate, and I think we may yet have it. I think it would be very healthy.
Lou Reed.
Well, what do you believe, Mr. Sullivan, that the Russians really want to achieve? What do you think that their major objective is? Do you feel that they want worldwide dominion? How do we get past this dilemma in which we aren't trusting each other in terms of weapons, we aren't trusting each other in terms of power? What do the Russians want, in your mind?
They say in their doctrinal writings of Marxism-Leninism, for example, in Communist, the party ideological journal published in the Soviet Union, what they want. They want world dominion. Now, only a small percentage of the Russian people, the Soviet people, subscribe to Marxism-Leninism. Even only a small percentage of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union really is guided by Marxism-Leninism. But that small segment of Soviet leaders who do believe in Marxism-Leninism are at the very top of the system, and they know that Marxism-Leninism not only guides their actions, but also is their only source of legitimacy. And so we have to take seriously, I think, the leadership's commitment to Marxist-Leninist principles, because they do. And it's that that's dangerous. In my view, that is the main obstacle to equitable arms control and to stability in the world.
Do you believe that they would then be willing to use military force to attempt to acquire this?
Absolutely. They're doing it today all over the world. They're using military force in Central America, in Afghanistan, against Poland. They're using military force in unprecedented scope and scale. I don't think they would launch nuclear war, however, because they know how dangerous that would be and how irretrievable an act that would be, and they also think they can gain their objectives without nuclear war, and they're well on the way toward that objective.
Well, George Kennan, who of course is our national authority, diplomatic authority on Russia, believes that that we misunderstand the Russians and that they're interested in expanding their influence, but they're also very, very concerned about appearances. And so what would you say, if you agreed with that they are concerned about appearances, what would you say the Reagan administration is doing in order to make sure that the question of face and appearances and image is handled in a graceful way as we attempt to set up the negotiations?
I would agree with George Kennan that the Soviets are concerned with appearances. I think it's remarkable that the Soviets have managed to turn the tables on world public opinion in such a way that the United States, especially the Reagan administration, is regarded as the main villain of arms control, when in fact the Soviets not only are violating all the existing arms control agreements, but are building up their forces in provocative ways and have achieved superiority. And yet somehow it's our fault, and we look provocative when we're trying to build back toward parity and when we're trying to enforce the integrity of the arms control process by accusing them of violating. It's us who are the provocative ones, not them. And I think it's a remarkable achievement on their side in their propaganda organs of manipulating face, manipulating perceptions in not only the American press but in the world press. The United States is the great villains.
Well, the Reagan administration is certainly getting accolades for being good salesmen. How do you think that this has happened then, that we have been outsold?
I think the Soviets are better propagandists than we are, and they have a consistent line, and they manipulate not only their own media, but they do influence the European press, and they influence our own press. There's a recent book published called Target America, which documents the extent, which is only a tip of the iceberg, of the Soviet role in the U.S. political system, in the U.S. media. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It's very difficult to get hard evidence on. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and none of it is conclusive. But we do know from CIA estimates the scale and scope of Soviet propaganda around the world, and we can infer from that that they are certainly active inside the United States, which they describe as their main target.
Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, again, with your visit to our campus, you have used some other data to indicate that you think that concerning the lack of parity we have today, that we're now behind the Soviet Union, and since budgetary matters are one of your fields. You indicated over, I believe it was the last 10 years, that there's been a very significant difference in the amount of money spent by the United States and the Soviet Union, and I assume from what I've been reading, the Reagan administration is reversing that, and we may be spending more now than the Soviets. But would you give your data concerning the past 10 years and how much more money you think the Soviets have spent than we, and in what areas?
I sure will. This is a chart that shows defense spending. This, again, is a President Reagan chart that he used last November over the last decade, roughly. Now, this difference between the USSR and defense spending in the U.S. is $710 billion that they have achieved over us in advantage in defense spending. Now, we don't have to match them dollar for dollar, ruble for ruble, or even weapons system for weapons system necessarily. And so we don't necessarily need to spend $710 billion immediately to catch back up. But that's an example of the relative spending levels over time on the two sides. This chart shows what the Reagan administration is trying to do in defense spending vis-a-vis the USSR toward the end of the decade, out toward 1987. Now, one thing you should realize is that half of this growth in defense spending that the Reagan administration has proposed so far, half of it has been cut out by Congress. About $116 billion in budget authority has been proposed by the Reagan administration up through this fiscal year, and $58 billion has been already cut by the Congress. Moreover, you should be aware that the Reagan administration is only $12 billion ahead of the Carter administration in defense outlays through the end of this fiscal year. So the debate and the uproar about the so-called $1.6 trillion Reagan defense buildup is really a myth, because, in fact, the Reagan administration has spent only $12 billion in actual outlays on defense, more than the Carter administration planned in this same period. Moreover, if you look at defense spending in isolation, you can say $1.6 trillion is a lot of money over 5 years to spend on defense. But if you look at the rest of the government and what it spends, you will see that it's about $2.6 trillion that the rest of the government is spending over the same time frame. This is a chart that shows the relative percentage of the federal budget on defense over time. And you can see back in 1962, when President Kennedy was in office, we spent almost half of our federal budget on defense, and now under President Reagan we only spend a quarter. And yet Kennedy is regarded as a great humanitarian, a man who helped to develop the great society that Lyndon Johnson carried forward, and Ronald Reagan is a warmonger, because he's spending a quarter of the defense budget on defense. So I mean, this is the actuality. There are a lot of myths. What I'm suggesting is there are a lot of myths that are in our political vocabulary that we might ought to examine.
In relation to this, too, again, with your background in the budgetary processes, we have for a number of years, under different administrations, had a real problem with deficit spending, and now it's reached the highest proportions in our history. In relation, if I understand correctly, this next 5-year period, when you're talking about concerning increase in defense spending, it's going to go from somewhere around $280 billion up into over $400 billion a year by the end of that 5-year period. If this be the case, Mr. Sullivan, what kind of policy should we bring on board to deal with the deficit, or will this magnify the deficit problem?
Well, it can be asserted that the defense spending levels proposed by President Reagan are not the cause of the large deficits. Now, it's a technical economic argument to really support that assertion. I happen to believe it. Others believe that the main cause of our deficits are uncontrolled entitlements, the uncontrolled part of our budget that has grown. As this defense share of our federal budget has declined, you could draw another line just like this that shows entitlements have crossed and gone just the opposite way. And it's that element of our federal budget, entitlements, that we think are responsible for the deficits. And if we can't get a hold on those entitlements and on domestic federal spending, then we're not going to be able to reduce our deficits. And that's the struggle that's underway right now in the Senate on the budget. The Senate Budget Committee has reported out a budget that really does not control either entitlements or deficits, and in fact increases revenues and reduces defense as a means of trying to reduce in the out years the deficits. And that approach is under attack now by people who think that entitlements are the real problem with our deficits.
Lou Reed.
Mr. Sullivan, you must know that there's a growing body of people who think that this entire arms race is simply crazy, that it is totally insane,
Yes.
and that we shouldn't even be talking about these kinds of numbers. We should be talking about how do we get off dead center, and
Yes.
how do we possibly assure a peaceful world.
Yes.
What do you propose?
That's a very good question. However, here again we have another myth that we need to deal with. The arms race makes you think that nuclear weapons are the most expensive weapons in the world, and that the nuclear forces are driving our defense budget, which is driving our federal budget, which is driving our deficits. But this chart shows the percentage of our defense budget and our federal budget that's actually taken up in strategic forces. Over the last 20 years, you can see it's on the order of 15% a year of our defense budget, and a very small percentage of our federal budget. So there really is no arms race per se in spending terms. Moreover, the United States has unilaterally deactivated huge numbers of forces in the same time frame. So we're not racing.
What has the United States done that it's taken a very positive sense to move it from a military situation to a political one? What are we really proposing that are solutions as alternatives.
That's a good
to the
question
arms race.
also. Here is the President's START proposal on the table in Geneva for over the last year. This is the imbalance in strategic forces, missiles and bombers that I showed earlier on the other chart. The President is proposing that both sides reduce to an equal level much lower than where they exist now. Now, it's of course true that the United States would have to reduce slightly less, much less than the Soviets in order to achieve equality at lower levels. But this is a, I think, constructive proposal that the President has made in the strategic arms reduction talks. And notice also that this equal level approach is consistent with the Jackson Amendment to SALT I, which is the law of the land on U.S. arms control objectives. That is, that we have equal levels of forces in any arms control agreement with the Soviets. And that's embodied in the President's proposal.
What percentage is that?
Well, this would be about 850 missiles with about 5,000 warheads on both sides. And the two sides could mix their forces any way they like. They could concentrate on submarine missiles or land-based missiles. They could concentrate on large warheads or small. The size of the warheads doesn't really matter. Now, I might point out a fallacy, though, in this approach, and that is that it constrains warheads. And warheads, by the President's own admission, are impossible to verify. He said this himself in his first press conference as President. And moreover, he has already deactivated a third of our forces without asking for a quid pro quo from the Soviets. We've unilaterally deactivated a third of our existing capability, so that reduces Soviet incentive to ever agree to this kind of a proposal on our part when they can just watch us unilaterally deactivate a third of our forces. They have no reason really to agree to a proposal that would require them to reduce much more than it would us when they can get what they want just by watching.
I don't understand why that is not verifiable, why deactivating is not verifiable.
Oh, deactivating is verifiable. Warheads are not verifiable because even with on-site inspection, you could go up to a missile, take the nose cone off and count the number of warheads on it, put the nose cone back on and go away, and it could become a shell game. The Soviets could adjust the number of warheads under the nose cone either before or after your on-site inspection. We could do the same. That's the main reason that warheads are not verifiable, that even with the most intrusive kinds of verification, on-site inspection, you still would have a great problem.
But doesn't some kind of risk have to be taken along the way
Sure,
to say all these numbers don't matter?
Well, the numbers do matter. I mean, we need to work toward world peace and stability, and these numbers have a bearing on that. Your point's well taken, however. Verification is an essential element of our proposal. We would require enhanced verification for a START or INF agreement, such as on-site inspection. And even with on-site inspection, we would still have large uncertainties. We would have to work in conjunction with our national technical means, and we would have to have also cooperative measures to enhance verification, such as Soviet demonstrations of certain things, actually letting us into their laboratories, and we would have to reciprocate, of course. These are the kinds of verification measures that are going to be absolutely essential to any future arms control regime, especially given the pattern of Soviet violation of all the existing arms control agreements today, which the President has accused them of in 5 cases himself.
Mr. Sullivan, another area that is of great concern to you, and I know it's the administration, and you made that point very strongly today, and that is the verification problem, and Lou's just been discussing that somewhat with you. But you have indicated that President Reagan has 5 particular treaties and agreements combined, that where there's been verification problems, or there's been, I suppose I should say, violations, and then it caused you to worry about verification. We're short on time, but would you list those 5 and give us a few examples of where you think there's been a violation?
Yes, President Reagan himself has accused the Soviets of violating 5 existing arms control agreements, and I will list them in order of their significance. The SALT II Treaty he's accused them of violating. He's accused them of violating the Kennedy-Khrushchev Agreement of 1962, which ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's accused them of violating the Threshold Test Ban Treaty of 1976. He's accused them of violating the Biological Warfare Convention of 1975 and the Chemical Warfare Protocol of 1925. The best cases in point for these 5 accusations, the Soviets are flight testing 2 new type ICBMs, which violates the essential provision of SALT II, Article 4, Paragraph 9. The Soviets have tested underground nuclear weapons above the 150 kiloton threshold of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. We now believe with 95% confidence that several of those tests of the 15 we know to be above the 150 kilotons are in violation with 95% confidence. There's conclusive evidence that the Soviets are using biological and chemical warfare agents in Southeast and Southwest Asia, and that they had a plant at Sverdlovsk blow up in 1979 which was making and storing biological agents. In the case of the Kennedy-Khrushchev Agreement of 1962, the Soviets have MiGs and Bear bombers and strategic submarines and a combat brigade all deployed in Cuba, and they have delivered 3 times the amount of military equipment to Cuba last year than they did in 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mr. Sullivan, I don't want to skirt on the area of national security, but
Sure.
in concerning the violations of those particular 5, what sources are we using? Is it our own government agencies? How sure can we be, because there is, as you've already indicated, a verification problem.
Very good question.
Maybe there's more than this in violations, or how sure are we about the ones that we have already found?
That's a very good question. In the case of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, we have 95% confidence, and it's almost unanimously agreed within the U.S. government. There's still some disagreement, and that hasn't been resolved yet. In the case of the Biological Warfare Convention and the Chemical Warfare Convention, there is unanimous agreement among the leaders of the Reagan administration and amongst the different agencies of our national security bureaucracy that there's conclusive evidence of Soviet violation. We're trying to handle this problem in diplomatic channels, both bilateral and multilateral.
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. I wish we could proceed that further, but time has caught up with us, and we're out of time. I want to thank Lou Reed for her very fine questions, and I want to thank you for being with us. It's been most informative.
Thank you, Tony.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. David Sullivan, who served as Deputy Chief of the Transition Team for the Arms Talks in the Reagan administration from the Carter administration. He now serves with 2 U.S. senators dealing with budget, defense, and foreign affairs. I hope that you'll join us again next week when we continue this 5-week series on the question of nuclear war and the dangers and realities. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, we bring you the 3rd program in a 5-week series on the topic nuclear war, the dangers and realities. I'm happy to welcome to our program Dr. Daniel Ellsberg to deal with this in our 3rd program. The topic we will deal with today will be basically a review of the United States nuclear arms policy from Truman until the present time, and our panel will deal with questions basically in that area. Dr. Ellsberg holds a very distinguished background to come to this subject. First of all, he has a BA as summa cum laude from Harvard University. He holds a PhD in economics from that same institution. He's had numerous experiences that relate to this field. First of all, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 1954 to 1957. He has worked for many private institutes in research and consulting, and he worked for the government of the United States in a number of capacities. He has worked with the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the White House. Particularly his work in those areas has been dealing with command and control of nuclear weapons and on strategic nuclear war plans. Among those individuals that he has worked for have included, first of all, George Bundy during the Kennedy years, and secondly, he worked for Dr. Henry Kissinger at various times concerning this very important issue. Dr. Ellsberg, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I'm happy to welcome to the panel to assist in the question today, first of all, Father Bill Wasmuth with the St. Pius Catholic Church in Coeur d'Alene, and regular panelist, and always happy to have her with us, Mary Lou Reed. I will invite Father Wasmuth to commence the questioning.
Doctor, I appreciated very much your presentation just a little bit ago, and I guess one of the things that was going through my mind, and it's probably a good way to start, is how did you make the transition in your own self from what you were involved in when you were working for the government to the stance that you have now, which is very critical of the government? What was the trigger in there?
Well, my attitudes on nuclear weapons and nuclear war really have not changed. I could say since I was a boy when a nuclear weapon was used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but certainly not since the late 50s when I began working for the government on nuclear war plans. There is a difference that at that time I really could not conceive that my country had plans or any intention of initiating nuclear war under any circumstances. And I was mistaken about that. With all the clearances that I had been kept ignorant of the number of times in which the United States had already threatened or prepared to initiate nuclear war in Korea, in Indochina already, in the Taiwan Straits. And these were closely held secrets at the time, but they are available now. Most Americans still don't know them, but I do. So that does affect what I do about my feelings at this point. Second thing, obviously my shift involved Vietnam primarily, and there my attitudes did change a good deal about the purposes of U.S. intervention, the legitimacy of it, as well as any prospects of success. Still, I wasn't very different from most people working for the government, from private to general to cabinet official by 1968. Really, most of us who worked on Vietnam realized that the war was not to be won, that it was at best a stalemate, and that we should get out. But the war was fought by such people. After the Tet Offensive in '68, the war had 7 years to go, and it was essentially fought by people in the government, civilian or military, who no longer believed in it. The change for me in that respect from these others was that I learned that there were better ways to exercise my influence as a citizen than by talking in private and in secret to executive branch officials. That if the war was going to change, it was going to have to be done by Congress, and if that was going to happen, the public had to make the pressure, and the public wouldn't be likely to do that unless they had the information. I couldn't give them the information that I had, that was in my authorized possession, without taking a risk. I thought a certainty of going to jail. I was, in fact, brought up on charges of 115 years in prison, actually, for putting out the Pentagon Papers. I wouldn't have thought of doing that, which is your question now, anyway, without the direct example of other Americans who were going to jail, and many thousands more who were risking it, mostly in resisting the draft at that point, in order to precisely to put that question in my mind. What could I do to end the war if I were willing to go to jail? And when I asked the question, I thought of something useful to do right away.
Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Ellsberg, you have said that present and past administration officials trust the Russians more than you do, and that the present arms buildup in your mind is meant to make the world safe for the U.S. to intervene in disputes. Would you explain what you're saying in terms of the fact that the Russians perhaps can no longer be trusted as they once were to back down?
Well, in the first place, when I say that I think people like Edward Teller on the outside of the government, who has been apparently so influential right now in encouraging the president to launch this Star Wars anti-ballistic missile space campaign, and President Reagan himself and others, trust the Soviets, it seems to me, in a number of ways that I don't think is justified. They seem to believe that the U.S. can buy superiority in the race by virtue of our larger economy, which means in some sense that they trust the Soviets ultimately to buy butter instead of guns, no matter how many guns we buy and what type, that they trust the Soviets to back off in the race, basically, and let us forge ahead into a decisive superiority. We couldn't get a superiority if they set out to match us. Any attempt at that could only mean, any meaningful advantage at all from these weapons we're buying could only come if the Soviets stopped. I don't trust them to stop. I think they will match it. But more significantly than that, I think even if the Russians do match us, and perhaps that's what they really expect. I do think they are buying these weapons in order to back up our interventionary forces with the threat that we would initiate nuclear war if those forces got into trouble. The assumption is that our forces couldn't get into trouble, couldn't be surrounded, couldn't be threatened with defeat or even stalemate unless the Soviets were strongly involved on the other side, backing up our immediate opponents. And there's some basis for that. Their hope then is that saying if the Soviets go that far, if they challenge us to this point, they are risking that we will initiate nuclear war, in hopes that the Soviets will then back down, as they did back down in the Cuban crisis, in the Berlin crisis, in the Taiwan Straits, and really a number of other cases. But that was an era when the Soviets had no nuclear weapons that could reach the United States to speak of. An era when the asymmetry in our favor was so enormous that we had what amounted to a monopoly of strategic nuclear power. That monopoly went away 15 years ago. It went away as a price of the successes that we had had with these threats. The Soviets were determined to make every effort not to be humiliated in that way again. And what they have bought is indeed a military capability that's like ours, that is the equivalent of ours now, starting from almost nothing in the mid-60s. And so that means they have spent more money on this to buy that than we have in those years. That enormous investment they've made in order not to back down gives me no sense of trust at all that they will prudently back down in a challenge. I don't believe we should be making such threats, if ever it was right, and I don't believe it was ever right to make such threats. But even for those who would point to the successes and say they were worthwhile and it was all right in a world where we had a monopoly to make such threats, I don't think such people, if they knew the realities of the current situation, could reasonably back continuing to make such threats in a world where the Soviets do now have nuclear parity. And yet our presidents, not only Reagan, but his predecessor, Carter, in the Middle East are making such threats today.
Dr. Ellsberg, in relation to what you were talking about threats at your speech today with the audience, you gave some examples from different periods in history in which we had reached that point of threat and a crisis. And I wish you would take a little time to give this information that you presented to our audience.
Yeah. The references for this, I didn't mention it to the audience, by the way, maybe I will to this audience, are given in an introduction that I wrote to a book called Protest and Survive, edited by Thompson and Smith. So the individual cases, I think, are all can be looked up at this point. The stuff is on the record, though it wasn't at the time. Just to summarize this history of the last 30 years or so, the cases include Truman's threat, a public threat, in fact, that he was considering the use of nuclear weapons at the point that Marines were surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, the end of November 1950. The Marines, by the way, fought their way out without the use of nuclear weapons, and so that threat was not implemented. 1953, President Eisenhower threatened the Chinese directly through several channels that he would use nuclear weapons if they did not accept his terms at Panmunjom, which they did accept. He regarded that as a crucial victory for his secret nuclear threats. Secret, by the way, obviously not from the Chinese, were the recipients of the threats. Secret from the American people, who might have opposed them, not probably because they were sure the threats couldn't work. Threats were quite likely to work in an era when the Soviets, as allies of the Chinese, had no operational weapons at all, though they had tested a weapon. But the American people would have noticed that they weren't sure to work. And Eisenhower himself says that in his memoirs. He was worried about Russian retaliation, possibly against the Japanese. They couldn't reach the U.S. in those days, but the Japanese were at risk, some risk. He didn't tell the Japanese that. They didn't know about the threats. And I think some allies of ours in Europe have taken a lesson from that experience. Anyway, the next year, emboldened by the success in Korea, he offered the French 3 nuclear weapons for the defense of Dien Bien Phu. And the French turned these down because they were afraid, again, that they might get retaliation in Europe, and because they thought their own troops might be destroyed by these weapons if they came a bit too close. In 1955 and again in 58, there were crises in the Taiwan Straits where Chinese nationalist troops were on islands just a few miles off mainland China. Again, President Eisenhower in this case actually authorized planning, detailed planning for the use of nuclear weapons if necessary to defend those islands. And again, the Chinese backed off. But before they backed off, they had been handed a trigger on the U.S. nuclear forces. The American people didn't know that, didn't know that there was a nuclear crisis going on at that moment. But it was up to the Chinese to try to invade those islands, which would have amounted to pulling the trigger on our nuclear weapons. 61, there was the Berlin crisis. 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis. These were public crises on the whole. Though I find that even today, over 20 years later after Berlin, very few Americans realize that the threats of nuclear war that President Kennedy was making public, threats that led him to urge Americans to get fallout shelters by the end of the year, were threats of an American-initiated nuclear war. Not threats that we would initiate hostilities, but that if hostilities arose which we couldn't handle, which would have been very easy to occur in the Berlin area where we were outnumbered, inside East Germany, it would not be the Soviets who would start that nuclear war as a result with what they then had in the way of intercontinental forces. They had 4 ICBMs then. The next year they had 10 operational ICBMs, facing a force on the U.S. side that involved 200 missile warheads, including IRBMs, but more importantly, 3,000 bombers within range of them to their 193. They were indeed likely, but far from certain, to back down then. In 62, they were likely to back down, as they did. If you knew what the balance was, the public didn't on the whole. But Kennedy did, and even so, he judged the risks of general war as being between 1/3 and 1/2. Now, Cuba was not an unimportant issue. But whether the American public would have thought it was worth a 50% chance of blowing up the Northern Hemisphere is another matter, and that applies to Berlin. Other threats occurred in 1968, Quezon, 1973 in the Arab-Israeli War on both sides, and most recently over the Middle East by both Carter and Reagan, who've said that their policy was to introduce an American presence in that area such that if the Soviets intervened in further than they have already in Afghanistan, in Iran, for example, they would be risking World War III. And again, as in 1961, that would inevitably be nuclear war initiated by the U.S., not by the Soviets, who outnumber us in that area 20-1, since it's on their border, just as we would outnumber them in Mexico or Canada.
Dr. Ellsberg, in relation to recent crises, Iran and Afghanistan and so forth, from your research, have there been any cases where the Soviet Union has used the same approach toward the United States to keep them from intervening?
Well, actually the Soviets, Khrushchev did make threats both in the Suez Crisis and in connection with Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, and then later Cuban, mainly the Bay of Pigs. And those threats were, in retrospect, almost certainly bluffs, total bluffs. The Soviets had essentially nothing to back them up with at that point. Khrushchev chose to make threats instead of building missiles, to make bluffs, in effect, instead of missiles. And that's why he was deposed after humiliating backdowns in Taiwan, in Cuba, and in Berlin. He was replaced by Brezhnev, who said, "We'll never have to back down again for that reason. We will build up what it takes so we don't have to back down." Nevertheless, those threats by Khrushchev, I would say, showed a willingness to take part in this kind of nuclear diplomacy, whether he had what it took or not. And again, that doesn't give me any confidence that the Soviets will, in the future, refrain from making those threats if they feel they have to. It's, of course, just as dangerous for them to do that as it is for us to do it today. We have forces with parity. Terribly reckless, terribly irresponsible, I would say. As much so for them to ever make such a threat as for us. I repeat, I don't trust them to show the good judgment forever in using those weapons that they've spent so much to acquire. I want to see those weapons taken out of their hands. I don't want to see them acquire new weapons, the new weapons that are under development there now. I know of no way to keep the Soviets from acquiring those new weapons that allows us to go on building on our side. I know no way of stopping them from introducing weapons like the Pershing, like the MX, like the Trident D5, all of which are ahead of their capability now, that would allow us to go ahead. In other words, I don't see any way of doing it other than starting with a halt, a bilateral halt that would affect both of us, and moving to bilateral negotiations. President Reagan has been so far unwilling to propose that possibility, to explore whether it's possible to get.
Father Bill.
Why didn't we use a nuclear threat to end Vietnam?
To end the war in Vietnam?
Or to win it, maybe?
Well, good question, and but not too hard to answer in a way. If you're thinking now about the time when we would have been tempted to do that, 68, 69, 70, and thereafter, to seek very ambitious ends, most presidents would have refused to do that, like Johnson, for the reason that it was not like Korea in '53, no Soviet weapons. We're now facing a Vietnam with no weapons, just as Korea itself had no weapons, or China, but again allied to the Soviet Union, which now has, by '68, had close, as I recall, to 1,000 missiles. The situation was transformed. That would have kept most people from trying to win the war as Eisenhower, end the war as Eisenhower did. It didn't keep the man who had been Eisenhower's vice president in '53 from having that ambition. Richard Nixon learned the same lesson Eisenhower did, and unfortunately had not forgotten it by '69. His chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, has revealed, and others now have confirmed, that Nixon came into office determined to win the war in Vietnam as Eisenhower had ended the war in '53 in Korea.
Even with nuclear threats?
By making nuclear threats. And this is, you didn't know that, I take it, in asking the question.
For sure, no.
Well, you didn't read Haldeman's memoirs? Is that possible?
That's true.
I may be the only one who did. If Haldeman read them, then there would be two of us. But he does, in fact, describe that. Others have, as I say, have confirmed it since then. Nixon goes into a good deal of detail on what he calls his November ultimatum, November '69. He doesn't say what it was. Haldeman tells us that. But he does say it was much more force than Johnson had used. And Johnson had used 50% more tonnage of bombs on Vietnam than we used in all of World War II. Of course, Nixon did manage to top that. He dropped 2 World War IIs without using nuclear weapons. But the reason he didn't carry out his threat to use nuclear weapons, he tells us why he didn't carry out his ultimatum, was that in fact it was timed for November 1st, 1969, and fell right in between 2 events known as the Vietnam Moratorium, days in which the U.S. public took off from work on a weekday, what amounted to a general strike, to hold demonstrations, teach-ins, vigils of various kinds, on October 15th, '69, and on November 15th, '69, right overlapping his ultimatum. And when between 1 and 2 million people turned out on October 15th across the country, President Nixon says in his memoirs, I realized my ultimatum had failed, and he had to start thinking of how to back off from it. He didn't want to carry it out because, as he said, the country would not have supported me if I had carried out my escalation of the war. So the people who then, without knowing it, the people who demonstrated on October 15th, 1969, and I'll bet there are people in this audience who could remember doing that when they were 5 or 6, wearing black armbands and being with their older brother and sister. I find a lot of people remember that. What they didn't know then, or often until I tell them, because they haven't read Nixon's memoirs either, I find, is that they were stopping nuclear war at that point. And even without nuclear war, stopping non-nuclear bombing that would have killed hundreds of thousands of people. They were being very powerful. I think we need them to do that again.
Lou Reed.
Is this how you feel we're going to get out of the dilemma right now, that we have this parallel with Vietnam and that we're going to have a mass protest again?
Yes, I think it applies both to the Central America issue, which is an exact analogy to Vietnam, and to ending the arms race. Another exact analogy to Vietnam is Russia in Afghanistan. I think the analogy is extremely close. There are always differences in situations, in language, in geography, and so forth. But in fact, I think what the Russians are doing in Afghanistan is neither more justified than what we did in Vietnam, nor in any way more humane. It's absolutely unconscionable. But the Soviets don't have the way of getting out of it that we had. For them to demonstrate, for the Soviet public to demonstrate, they would first have to learn what was happening, actually. They have much less ability to do that than we do. And second, as the casualties come in, they do begin to get the idea, they would have to take risks that we don't have to take in this democracy. I'd say we have a responsibility to use our freedoms that does not bear on Russian citizens in quite the same way. They don't have the freedom to do what we have to do to get us out of such a war. Similarly, on the arms race, if it took demonstrations in the Soviet Union to make Soviet leaders ready to end the arms race, I would despair of ending it, because I don't believe the U.S. will end it by itself, unilaterally. That is not proposed by the freeze movement, and if it were proposed, I don't think it would have any chance of succeeding. If the Soviets, our leaders, are not willing to end the arms race, then it won't be ended. They will continue, and they will not be subject to demonstrations. They do say they are ready to end it. Their economy is half the size of ours. The burden on them is greater even than it is on us. They say they are. Our president is not willing to find out if they're sincere in that. He's not willing to propose it and discuss it. Given that, I think it's up again to Congress to take away the arms race from the president, as they took away the bombing from President Nixon.
What do you call upon the American people to do then in response to this challenge?
I think the entire range of actions that were effective and successful in getting Congress to cut off the money for the bombing of Vietnam, all the nonviolent actions, I think the few isolated examples of violence helped Nixon prolong the war, and that would be true today on both of these issues. But the actions ranging now from letter writing, which was effective, was important, more than I realized at the time, lobbying, campaigning, backing candidates who are with a mandate to change the situation, especially in Congress, I would say, and demonstrating.
Signing petitions?
And I would include nonviolent civil disobedience. What was your?
I was saying signing petitions. And this.
Petitions, obviously Congress's willingness to challenge the president and to cut off the funds for the MX dense pack system. The first refusal by Congress to fund a major weapons system since the Second World War. That was a direct response of the referenda, even though they were non-binding, that had been held in 10 states in the preceding election, a couple months earlier, in which 9 of those states backed the freeze. And that was directly reflected in Congress. Nothing, even though it was a lame duck Congress, and that surprised me, I might say. Congress doesn't always see the light, but they feel the heat. And in an election like that, they understood that they would lose their jobs, ultimately, if they refused to obey a mandate that clear. We've got to make that mandate ever more clear for Congress, not stop. And so they'll do what we want them to do on this issue. And what the American people want them to do is to, first, demand proposals from the U.S. government and a willingness to explore a bilateral, verifiable, negotiated freeze, an end to the arms race, and then reductions, bilateral reductions. Second, I believe they should demand, with these actions, ranging, as I say, from letter writing and petitioning to nonviolent civil disobedience, they should also demand, I think, a cutoff of the funds for the new weapons like the Pershing, the D5, Trident, the MX, so long as President Reagan, quite specifically, is unwilling to propose such a freeze. Because if Congress gives him the funds he's asking for, even those congressmen who want to see a freeze eventually, I think, are making it impossible. If those weapons go ahead, I think the Soviets will be foolish enough to imitate that testing and to try to develop the same kinds of weapons once we have them. I could say again, I don't trust them to leave us with a monopoly of those weapons, even though I think they should, if they had a chance for a freeze. That means our chance to keep open the possibility for a freeze later. We have got to stop these programs now, and if Reagan will not do it, Congress, pushed by the public, must do that.
Dr. Ellsbury, we're almost out of time, but one thing that's been thrown around all week here is the question of superiority and parity between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we've heard people debating whether it's on quantity or quality. In the very little time we have left, how would you address this issue? Do we have parity? What is
in
the
very
situation?
little time, I can say President Reagan is alone, as far as I can make out, as a major public figure in even in his own administration, in making the absurd and absolutely unfounded claim that the Soviets have any type of significant superiority, meaningful superiority of any kind. I have to use an adjective because the forces are not identical on either side, and one thing must be weighed against another. But no one, even in his own administration, including Weinberger, by the way, will speak out for the statement that the Soviets are now superior or about to be superior. That charge on which Reagan campaigned, which is no doubt why he's still saying it, is as false, the charge of imminent or current Russian superiority, as John F. Kennedy's claim of a missile gap was false in 1960.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're out of time. I want, on behalf of our staff, express our appreciation for your time and a very informative interview.
Thank you.
And I express my appreciation of the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Daniel Ellsberg. He is the third in a 5-week series that we're having concerning the issue of nuclear war, the dangers and realities. He's had many years' experience in government and in private sector and consulting concerning this very important issue. Hope you've enjoyed our program and that you will be with us for the next 2 weeks when again we will have guests dealing with this very, very important issue. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.